Hello, friends. Welcome. We're going to get started just momentarily. Hello, everybody. Hello, hello. And this is meeting format. We are live on YouTube. So if you don't want your beautiful face on YouTube, keep your camera off. And we'll get started here in just a quick moment. Yes. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Get some of the folks in. And I put the link to tonight's document and to the YouTube recording so you can watch it later. Hello, everyone. So nice to be here with you all tonight. All right, we'll get started and I will keep admitting folks in as we go along. And this is such the perfect pre-Halloween event, and with two very, very San Francisco folks. So I'm excited tonight to welcome you to Bob Calhoun and Alia Volz in convo. So first, some library news. We want to
I think we've lost Anissa momentarily.
Oh,
so Anissa, hello everybody. Anissa said, I'm just going to admit the people who are coming in, and hopefully they're not horrible monsters. That should be in the pages of this book. So Anissa said before we started that she is beaming in from a rural area and that it is possible that she might have some outages, and she just did. And she was about to introduce our event and talk about the library. I am ill-equipped to talk about the library, except to say that it is a fabulous place. Okay. I'm gonna stop.
I'm back, everyone. I'm sorry. Let's try it.
Are you back? Are you there? Oh no. Okay.
We needed the library copy. You know?
Yes. So we're supposed to be giving a spiel of something, say something about the library. I know that part of the library spiel. And here she is again. So maybe she can do it. Are you back? You're on mute, Anissa.
Woo! Sorry about this. Okay, we're gonna breeze this time, and let's try this one last time. I switched Wi-Fi networks. Here we go. All right, let's get rid of this thing. All right, welcome to the unceded land of the Ohlone tribal people. Our library wants to acknowledge that this is the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. As uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. And now some library news. Tomorrow night, we have our final Filipino American History Month with the amazing artwork of Alia Volz, not Alia Volz, of Lydia Ortiz, who, if you don't follow her Instagram, I definitely encourage you to do so. Her work is gorgeous and beautiful and vibrant, and I hope you all come out and support this amazing artist. And you can see her poster and artwork on our website and all over our libraries. The crew from SF Chronicle will be live, that's right, in the Correct Auditorium. Come on out. We have lots of space. We can spread out. We can be socially distanced, and we can enjoy the author convo with author Bonnie Swee. And they'll be talking about her book, Why We Swim. And Heather Knight and Peter Hartlaub have both taken the plunge. So come hear about their experience. And if you can't make it out or you're just not ready to make it out, we totally understand that. And you can catch this event on Zoom as well. And then just some quick other November events coming out. The amazing and iconic Malcolm Margolin, who is the founder of Heyday Books, will be Zooming in with friends, amazing human beings that will be with him. And this amazing human is not in the best of health. So this is going to be one of our last opportunities, I fear, to experience and witness his brilliance and genius and just, humane. He's just the most humane and gentle human I've ever seen. So please come on out and support that. And then that next Sunday, the 7th, again, we're trying for live in the Correct Auditorium. And it's a heyday month for November. We'll be celebrating Black Panther, Don, and his book, Making a Revolution. And his daughter and Steve Wasserman, who is the current director of Heyday, will be in convo. And I think I'm going to stop there so I don't lose any more. And I'm going to introduce Alia and Bob. Like I said, I think this is the perfect book for our pre-Halloween, our national holiday in San Francisco. Bob Calhoun is a San Francisco Bay Area author, journalist, and former punk wrestler and peepshow MC. Since 2015, he has recounted our city's most gruesome and lurid events in his regular weekly column, SF Weekly column, Yesterday's Crime. His punk wrestling memoir, Beer, Blood, and Cornmeal, is a national bestseller that Wired called breezy and hilarious. His follow-up, Shattering Conventions, Commerce, Cosplay, and Conflict on the Expo Floor, was spun off into a long-running column and video feature for Meetings Today, the trade magazine of the meeting and conventions industry. Calhoun's work has also appeared in the SF Chronicle, Salon.com, RogerEbert.com, Gawker and Bold Italic. And next up, Alia Volz, which I feel like we should just put Alia on our payroll because she's our friend of the library for sure. Alia has been, we hosted her. She was our On the Same Page, which is a bi-monthly read at our library. And we were so stoked about her book. And then she came out and talked with Total SF Crew. And her book, if you haven't read it, Home Baked, My Mom, Marijuana, and the Stoning of San Francisco, is amazing. And it was the winner of a Golden Poppy Award for nonfiction from the California Independent Booksellers and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in autobiography. She's homegrown San Francisco. Her work has been published in the Best American Essays, the New York Times, Bon Appetit, Salon, and more. And Alia has received fellowships from the McDowell and U Cross Foundation and has twice been awarded the Oakley Hall Memorial Scholarship. All right, without further ado, let's turn it over to our amazing guests for the night. Alia, Bob, it's all you.
Hi, everybody.
Hey.
Thank you so much, Anissa, for hosting us and braving the technological insecurity of Zoom. After all this time, it remains a roller coaster and an adventure. And thank you, everybody who's tuning in, for bearing with us. You know, it's what we have to do these days. Hi, Bob.
Hey, everybody. Hey, everybody in library land.
Library land.
Library land. I'd like to thank the San Francisco Public Library because this book wouldn't exist without their microfilm readers on the 5th floor, and especially their high-tech microfilm readers. Of course, just me bringing this thumb drive up to the 5th floor and downloading PDFs of microfilm every day. And then San Francisco Public Library finally made the Chronicle available digitally. So I didn't have to go there as much anymore, but whether I was going there or not, they made Murders That Made Us available. So I'd like to thank them and thank everybody for coming by tonight. And thank you, Alia, for moderating me.
Consider yourself moderated.
I am moderated.
Yes. Where would we be without the San Francisco Public Library? Agree on that totally. I'm so happy to do this with you and have wanted to do this since long before the book came out. I absolutely love The Murders That Made Us. This is such a great book. I got to read all the San Francisco history books, but I love dark histories and I love true crime. And so this was going to hit on all levels. I knew that it would. And it's especially meaningful to me that it comes from a homegrown Bay Arean.
I was born at UCSF. I just, I probably spent more time in outlying, border county, San Mateo County in my life than San Francisco itself. But yeah, I'm one of the weirdos, as I believe you are, that was born in San Francisco. So
yeah, and I mean it matters. I think it really matters when you're going to access a place from its dark history. I was thinking today about that fabulous line from the film The Last Black Man in San Francisco, where he says you're not allowed to hate San Francisco until you love San Francisco. I'm paraphrasing, but it's so meaningful to have a book like this come really from within the city, and so I appreciate that. I think that I was kind of obligated by birth to write Home Baked, and there's a way in which you were obligated by birth to write The Murders That Made Us, that it seems as though the inspiration came from a family story.
Yeah, I mean, my mother was once suspected of a murder. She was a murder suspect, and we'll get to that in a little more detail later. But she died in 2009. And one thing, if you have a parent that passed, especially when you're still somewhat young, because I mean, I was just 40, so I mean, it's not really young, but it's young for losing a parent. And I realized like that there were all these stories that she would tell, and they were just always there for my whole life, like just her going on about this or that again. Oh yeah, and I realized that I should have, when she was still lucid enough to tell these stories, like should have gotten them on tape, or should have really just gotten those stories one more time. And I hadn't done that. I didn't think to do it until it was kind of too late, even when she was alive. But the story about the murder was one that she didn't really talk about very much. And let me preface it a little bit. My family, this is about 10 years before I was born. They lived in Crocker, Amazon, right on the Daly City, San Francisco border. Dan White country.
Dan White country. I was about to say that.
Yeah, Dan White country. They left San Francisco before they could vote for Dan White, and so that I don't need to even broach the subject of what my Nixon voting parents, how they would have fallen in those races. But anyway, so yeah, there was this August Norrie. He was a kind of local handyman, kind of Lothario type. He was a minor league baseball player. Like he played for like the beer bottling team, and he couldn't quite make it onto the Seals or the Giants. Like he just he had good slow pitches, but not a good fastball, or I forget, it was something like that. He just couldn't quite make the cut, but a good athlete. Arthur Murray dance instructor. But he did gardening. He was like a kind of handyman gardener. And one day he was up on San Bruno Mountain dumping lawn clippings, because it was 1959 and everybody just dumped lawn clippings everywhere. And he was shot 18 times by a revolver, which means the person who shot him had to, if they shot a gun, they had to reload twice. That's 666, the number of the beast. So yeah, he was shot. Should I just read the chapter? Because I'm holding back too much, and I'm kind of sounding weird because I'm not wanting to repeat myself too much. But
Bob, don't be weird.
Oh well, I am weird though.
Don't be weird. Read.
Okay.
Yeah, please read the excerpt. I think
okay. Yeah. Well, I'll talk a little bit more about how, in more ways than one, this started The Murders That Made Us and started me writing true crime. Let me get a drink of water.
Ladies and gentlemen, he is having a drink of water.
A drink of water. Chapter 1. My mother, the murder suspect. My mother, Jackie Calhoun, only talked about the murder sparingly. Her hushed tones when she did stood in sharp contrast to how she spoke of everything else. Tales of a fight at the laundromat over the dryers, or that time the doctor and her hypochondriac friend, were retold often and in excruciating detail. My mother loved to gossip, and though the murder was her juiciest story by far, it was different. It was serious. The details of the murder that she told me were muddled in my mind by the names of friends and acquaintances she knew before I was born. From what I remember, a friend of the family's was shot in his truck by some crazy woman he picked up somewhere. He called her either a stupid fool or a stupid bitch, depending on the telling. That my mom could know this little detail didn't make sense because the murder took place in the suburban woods somewhere on the Bay Area Peninsula. But there was one detail of the murder that really stuck out in my mind. My mom spoke of growing suspicion among her clique of suburbanites as the murder investigation dragged on unsolved for months. You started to suspect everybody, friends, neighbors, she said. You didn't know who to trust. You wondered who could have done it. I always meant to write an article or even a novel out of all that backyard paranoia, but I never thought of asking my mom to retell the story of the murder until it was too late. She passed away in October 2009 after cancer had shrunk her down to almost nothing. My last conversations with her were about the hallucinations brought on by her steady supply of painkillers, or my pleading with her to drink her damned Ensure. I've never tasted Ensure, but it must be horrible. Elderly people would rather die than drink it. During those final days, I never asked my mom about the murder or about anything else for that matter. I didn't get the story of how she moved to San Francisco from Oklahoma in the 1940s, divorced my dad in the 70s, or that time in the 50s when she went to the Black Cat, a seminal gay bar with my dad and uncle, and all the men hit on them and ignored her. I know these stories well enough to tell you about them, but I only have recollections of her recollections, usually delivered from her favorite chair as she lit a smoke. Details are scant and murky. My dad, Leo Calhoun, is in good health, but he's pushing 80. I asked him about the murder while we were having lunch at a Peruvian restaurant in Redwood City, a once working class Bay Area suburb that's being gobbled up by Silicon Valley. Do you remember the murder my mom used to talk about? I asked. I think it happened back when you both lived in the Redwood City Hills, or maybe it was South San Francisco. I got the impression it happened out in the woods somewhere, but not too far out there. August Norrie, he answered, letting the victim's name hang in the air for a while. You know, your mother was questioned in the murder investigation, he said. She matched the suspect's description. A blonde was seen leaving the scene of the murder in Norrie's car. Your mother was blonde, and we lived next door to the Norries back then. They were looking for someone who was having an affair with him. This was a shock, to say the least. My mother never mentioned being braced by homicide dicks. I'd remember that. Anyone would remember that.
That's great. And what a way into this dark and often salacious, in the best of ways, history of San Francisco. I've been thinking in regards to this book about how, I mean, I love dark history. I think a lot of people do, and crime and true crime. But I've been thinking about the particular choice to explore a city through its criminal heart or through its underbelly, and what that might reveal about a place that's different. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, having written this wonderful dark history.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of funny because it starts with that story. And that story was something I tried to shop around to, you know, San Francisco Magazine. It still exists, the Chronicle, and even the Weekly, and nobody really wanted it. And it wasn't really because of the story. Editors thought it was good, but they had other things in the pipeline, other true crime stuff. And then the SF Weekly, like one of the editors there later on came to me and said, can you write a regular true crime series? And so it was just me coming up with random crime stories to write about every week. Mm-hmm. And people seemed to want a collection of it. And that's when I started thinking of arranging the stories I had and then adding others into a chronology of San Francisco through crime, because there was stories all over the place from 1850 to 1970 to even more recently, to even 2019 now, where the book ends. Yeah, and I think you could write a history of any American city or any city through crime. I think you could definitely do it for Chicago or New York or maybe Albuquerque, New Mexico. But I think San Francisco really lends itself to this because crime and punishment is woven into it's basically the Anglo-American city that is San Francisco. I'm not talking about what existed before then, the Spanish or Mexican city, but the Anglo-American city. It starts with the Vigilantes in 1851, and the idea of crime and punishment are kind of are our foundational event. That's where it starts. So you start basically with this kind of really thin line between who are the criminals and who are bringing justice. The people who are bringing justice are in those days are pretty criminal. So I just think that
I don't know that has changed all that much.
I don't know if it has either, but yeah, you just have that there. Like you begin with that issue right away with the Vigilantes. So it just lends itself to that. And then, other stories like I found I could write about like arts, movies, music, definitely music through crime. Like you can, there are crimes at the edge of all of these things, all of these music scenes, all of these art scenes, political scenes, definitely in politics. Oh, in a big way in politics from the 1850s through now, or definitely through Fajita Gate at the very least. You can tell stories about other things while you're telling stories about the crime. I mean, David Talbot did that to a large degree in Season of the Witch, but he's focused on like maybe 25 years, where I go a little bit longer in a shorter book somehow, but I go a little bit longer than that. But I just found like I didn't, I could be writing about crime, but also writing about other things and just telling the story of not just San Francisco, but the Bay Area. I do wander a bit. Sometimes LA gets brought in, but it's only from a San Francisco lens.
Yes.
Or a Bay Area lens.
I
Abigail Folger.
You had rules for yourself.
I had rules for myself.
Yes, I can talk about the Night Stalker, but I got to talk about the Night Stalker's San Francisco visits. And I feel like that worked really well, reading it. And of course, the Bay Area, I mean, San Francisco is a bigger place than the city of San Francisco, especially now. These days, the suburbs are so much integrated with the city, and there are moments when the city feels like a suburb of Silicon Valley. So we really are more of a I don't know what the word is. It's more of an amoeba than ever, I guess. But I really delighted in reading this book at like, I don't think a lot about where the street names of Brannon and Broderick and who these characters were, that we use their names every day, just getting around town. And it turns out that Brannon was this horrible grifter, and they're all awful. And not just awful in like the powerful white man sense, but also just criminal. I mean, they were violating all kinds of laws and treaties and basic decency. And now there are our lift directions.
Yeah. Well, Brannon, he basically, as the legend of Brannon goes, he like took tithe money from the Mormons. He was a high up in the Mormon church, and he parlayed tithe money into basically gold rush supplies. And some of that, there are these histories that say, well, that's overblown, or that's printing the legend. But I mean, the thing with the Vigilantes is that they often were trying to hang the wrong people, or just like they were after this Australian gang, the Sydney Ducks, but after a while, anybody with a funny accent, with a foreign accent, was good enough for hanging. They must have done something. Yeah. So I am on Team Broderick, though. It might just be my Irish heritage. He's like the Irish New Yorker, and he's like into rigging ballot boxes with false bottom ballots. But he's a little bit more honest. He's a little bit more honest than the other side that he was often opposed to in his grifting, and he liked to hang out in bars. And he died in a duel with pro-slave Democrats. It's that old Democratic Party schism. So yeah, he's kind of, to me, he's like the quintessential or the blueprint for the San Francisco liberal, where he's willing to rig elections and do all this kind of underhanded stuff, but he still fights the good fight at the right time. He still earns his liberal bona fides fighting against making California into a slave state. So
well, I feel that you just said something essentially true about this. Just leave that alone. But
yeah,
you said it. That was perfect. But I do want to touch on something else that you mentioned that really strikes me about this book and about writing about crime in general and why it's interesting. It's like there's the top surface, which is that it's salacious and fun, and who doesn't love a rollicking story? It's thrilling, it's a little scary, something horrible happens, but it doesn't happen to you. It was a long time ago, so it's fun, it's safe to go there. But what I find really emerges about the crimes of yesterday is that through going through these newspaper archives, the old sources, what really emerges are the prejudices of the day. It's the way the story was told then. And I feel like you do a lot of really great work with that. And in fact, the piece that we were talking, the other section that we were talking about that you might read, I feel like touches on this, about jazz mania, where in the end, the way that the piece is depicted in the media, the kind of play that the history makers of the moment, which is to say the media, the people who are writing the stories that we'll read 50 years later, 100 years later, are telling the story through a very specific lens with a very specific agenda.
Yep. Hearst. Hearst. Yeah, some of the Hearst Examiner stuff, like that was always, and the Hearst Examiner in LA too. It was some of the 30s and 40s Hearst stuff. I mean, the Cron too. I mean, it's just
they all did it though. I mean, the New York Times was as yellow as can be. I mean, they all did it.
Oh yeah, but it was definitely kind of eye-opening. Just the level of sometimes just out and out racism.
Yeah,
like reading about the destruction of the Fillmore district, just when the Examiner starts calling for that, when it was still Japantown or Little Tokyo as it's called, and just these slum. Yeah, I'm not even going to quote this stuff, but you can imagine, or you can find it yourself. And part of the reason though I love quoting these old newspaper articles is I'm naturally kind of a humorist. Mm-hmm. And I just want to work in satire and things, but you're dealing with these terrible events and these tragedies and these horrors that were, vested upon people. So I had to pick my spots, and you could, I hope that this doesn't happen, but I never wanted to look like I was making light of the crime itself, or definitely of the victims. Mm-hmm. So the media and the political reaction to these things are where I can go to work on that.
Yeah.
And then
they do it themselves in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, they set themselves up and you deliver the punchline, but
you just have to quote some of this stuff. Just let them run the quote. This is what they said in the Cron or the Examiner or the Oakland Trib or any of them.
Do you want to read the Jazz Mania?
Yeah, let me read about the Jazz Girl. We all love the Jazz Girl. We were talking about like which other section, because I've been doing a lot of these readings live, and it's kind of weird because I've been booked at like the Alameda Oddities Market, and it's like I'm live entertainment and I'm doing sets. So thankfully this book is broken up into all these little stories. And so I can just rattle off a bunch of these weird little stories, for an audience. And, so it's kind of cool that for this one, I get to read a couple of different ones, but we were talking about Little Dick or the Jazz Girl, and we're going 20th century. We aren't going to spend let's go 20th century. So, okay. This is on page 70 if you want to follow along. A fit of jazzmania. Dorothy Ellingson was off to an early start. By the time she was 12, she was already knocking back gin and running with jazz musicians at the new Shanghai Cafe in Prohibition-era Chinatown. After 4 years of this, her mother, Anna Ellingson, finally put her foot down. On January 13th, 1925, Anna tried to keep her daughter from running wild at jazz parties, quote unquote. It didn't work. Dorothy got her brother's army pistol, shot her mother in the back of the head, and pilfered $45 from her mother's purse on her way out the door. She spent the rest of the night partying at a friend's apartment while her mother's corpse grew cold in the family's Richmond district flat. When Ellingson was arrested 2 days later, newspapers as far away from the murder scene as New York and Miami carried the story of the 16-year-old Swedish girl who killed her mother in a fit of jazz mania. Matricide moved newsprint, and reporters dubbed Ellingson the Moth Girl, the Jazz Girl Murderer, or my personal favorite, the Jazz Baby Mother Slayer. Jazzmania somehow never made it into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, although it was floated as a legit defense at the time. In the wake of the murder, Prohibition officials promised raids on San Francisco's Jazzland. Described as the wickedest spot in America, this kindergarten of vice was just off Bartlett Street in the Mission. Police also combed through Ellingson's diary and charged some of her boyfriends in the jazz scene with contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Keith Lord, a banjo picker with the Frisco Five, told police she said she was 19. Some things never change. Ellingson's trial began in March 1925. After collapsing in the courtroom several times and threatening to choke her own attorney, she was sent to Napa State Hospital for treatment in April before returning to San Francisco later that summer to resume the trial. Despite Ellingson's courtroom histrionics, Dr. Zhao Donbal, chief defense alienist, testified Ellingson was slightly abnormal but completely sane. On August 22, 1925, Ellingson was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years in San Quentin, which held women prisoners until 1932. Ellingson was released on parole in February 1932 after serving 6 years and 6 months. I deeply regret that I never did appreciate my parents, she said upon her release. A year later, she attempted suicide after being accused of stealing jewelry and a black velvet dress from her roommate. All charges from this incident were dismissed. Ellingson got married 2 years later and became a mother herself, having 2 children. She died on September 16th, 1967.
I think, I want to say before anything else, because I keep forgetting to mention this. Folks out there, if you have a question for Bob, please type it in the chat. And in 15 minutes or so, we'll have an open Q&A. So I'll be happy to pass your questions along to him, and we can discuss them as a family. That's a nice family story, Bob.
Oh yeah, the Jazz Baby Mother Slayer. You know?
Yeah, no, but I do love how you work with the old headlines and it highlights the moral concerns of the day. It certainly highlights the racism of the day. You touched, of course, on the redevelopment agency, the destruction of the Fillmore Jazz District. This was a little bit after, that came a little bit after this, but is probably one of the most criminal events in our civic history, particularly in the sense of the crimes that it spawned, in a way.
Yeah, I write about Charles Sullivan, who was the person who made the Fillmore into the Fillmore Auditorium. He was a black music promoter, and he was actually his story is really interesting. Usually he's brought up as a conduit to Bill Graham because he does give Bill Graham his start. And every time I tried to write about Graham and the Grateful Dead and all that, I just got really, really bored.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, I'm gonna do what's usually done with Charles Sullivan is he's just kind of skipped over, or he's like a character in Bill Graham's life. I'm just gonna make Bill Graham a character in his life. But he sold the Fillmore out to Bill Graham because the Fillmore district was being torn down. It was being destroyed for urban renewal. One of the great tragedies and the great crime itself, but perpetrated by city leaders and redevelopment agencies and Congress.
Yeah.
The United States Congress, that these funds were approved, and the Black people and even some of the Japanese people were moved on out for new buildings. They destroyed all the Victorians, which some of them are left, are on the front of the beginning of Full House. Is it Full House? Is that the sitcom? I'm not being good 80s person, but yeah, it's like the whitest sitcom ever. There's those four painted ladies that are left from that destruction. But yeah, Charles Sullivan, his story is really intense because his mother sold him as a slave. Like, this is way after the Civil War. She sold him to another Black family to like work on their farm as basically like an indentured servant or a slave. And Sullivan escapes when he's a teenager. He comes to LA, then San Francisco, can't find work. As a machinist, he can't get in the machinist union because they won't let a Black man into these unions, even with the war starting. Ends up becoming a chauffeur for a rich lady in Hillsborough, socks away all his money and starts buying bars. And bars are a really good investment after the war is over. Bars and liquor stores, and then later jukeboxes. They're all great investments after the war is over. And he becomes as wealthy as an African-American in San Francisco can be, and he ends up creating the Fillmore. He's also one of the first people, or maybe the first person, concert promoter to book live music at the Cow Palace. So he starts arena rock with booking James Brown and Ray Charles at the Cow Palace, and he books the whole circuit on the West Coast. And in 1966, like, he's a guy who always carried a lot of cash around. He would just have like the gate from these shows like as much as $6,000 or $7,000, which, don't make me look at an inflation calculator. Just know it's like 50,000 now. And he's shot out in south of Market over by the Caltrain station and left. His body is discovered later. And he supposedly had a valise with about $6,000 in it. That was gone. So it was probably just a robbery, probably somebody who knew or set him up to take the money. And the murder is still unsolved. It was never really closed. And Sullivan just didn't really get, it's kind of funny. Like, August Norrie, like, made headlines for days and days and days, just some guy cleaning up lawns out in Daly City. But Charles Sullivan just he was shot. Nobody knows who did it. It was just a one-day headline. Some of the other earlier stories about him and him basically being sold into slavery were done by Warren Hinkle a couple of years earlier, and those provided a lot of great research material. So thank you, Warren, for that. Thanks for following that story. And but yeah, the urban renewal, the destruction of the Fillmore, I was able to tell that story while telling the story of Charles Sullivan.
Right.
And as you said, how it led to other crimes in the book. I'm not sure if it's the authors of the book Harlem of the West, but one of the voices in that book says that because the Black neighborhood was destroyed in the Fillmore, that's what gave rise to Jim Jones.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know where I picked that up either, but it's a piece of the puzzle that fits so well that it's hard to not just completely buy that. I mean, not only the People's Temple, but we were talking, this is not so much in the book, but we were talking separately about the zebra killings, and someone is asking in the comments here about the zebra killings, but that a lot of the destruction of a thriving Black neighborhood with huge cultural resources, community resources, going generations deep at that point, left this gaping hole. And then where do people turn? And that leaves room for people like Jim Jones to come in. And at the beginning, he was really building social projects that helped a lot of people at the beginning. It was a coming together of races for a period of time. And so he filled a much needed space, drug rehab, senior housing. I mean, all this stuff. And you cover it very well in your book. I think you make that connection beautifully. I guess I want to move on because of time, but one of the things that I really love about this, and it's kind of on the topic that we're on already, is like, so you tell a lot of stories that I've never heard before. And I have so many questions for you about how you found them, like the jazz girl. I don't know how you found that story, and I do want to ask, but I also want to talk about how you handle the big stories that we all know. We all know the People's Temple story, or most of us do at least. Patty Hearst and the SLA, the Milk and Moscone assassinations, really big headline stuff that's been widely consumed. As somebody who's written about these topics myself, and you and I have talked about this, I go like, oh God, do I have to read another chapter about this topic? I've already read everything. I've already written about it myself. I'm tired of it. You found really interesting angles and side stories that I hadn't heard before. And I'd like to hear about your process, how you figured that out, why.
Yeah, with People's Temple, I mean, one thing you're avoiding in this is just kind of like recreating Wikipedia. If I'm just going to say this thing happened and here's who did what to whom and when, then I'm just kind of giving you what you have through Wikipedia. Where with People's Temple, I had known about these like murders that happened. Like a lot of people involved with People's Temple met violent ends after Guyana.
Right.
And so I had wanted to focus on that. And that was like originally a little series I did in my weekly column, which, I called it The Last Victims of Jonestown, where, there's the couple, they were actually Jonestown whistleblowers who turned up dead a year after Guyana. There was this kind of crooked private eye that worked with the concerned relatives of, like former People's Temple members, as well as he was kind of double agent for them and Jim Jones.
So weird.
And, may have provided the extra boost of paranoia to Jim Jones to start the massacre, to start the Guyana tragedy. And then there was also another former People's Temple member that did a mass shooting at a grammar school in Los Angeles in the 80s. And so you just have these, and there's other ones I didn't even mention. There was another People's Temple member who called a press conference and killed himself in front of the press. And that's one that I didn't get to. Like there's even more of them than I write about. But those were, I never really, like I said, there is an intro to the People's Temple chapter, definitely in the Jim Jones chapter. There's an intro to explain what the whole thing is. And, but I wanted to, and the same thing, the same thing to a degree, like I was a little more interested with the SLA and the murder of Marcus Foster, the superintendent of schools in Oakland that Sin-Q and the Symbionese Liberation Army killed before they kidnapped Patricia Hearst. And although I do write about Patricia Hearst as well, I found the angle I found with Patricia Hearst was just believing Patricia Hearst instead of the endless Jeffrey Toobin debate of like, how brainwashed was she and all that kind of stuff. It's like, no, she was really, really horribly abused. But I'm kind of going off the tracks a little bit, but it was like you mentioned Richard Ramirez. It was like, he came up to San Francisco and he murdered and assaulted this couple out close to Daly City. And that was near the end of his reign of terror. So I work in his his end in Los Angeles and East LA, because I love the story where the people of East LA rise up against him. That's like my favorite part of that. It's like, so I had to get that in there, and that luckily they were within, a few weeks of each other. So I could just kind of tell Richard Ramirez from San Francisco through his end.
It is a great moment in the book when that happens. So I have so many more questions for you, and I can't stand it, but we're actually getting to where I should open up. Let me see. One more question that I could ask of my own. I just want to know how you found these damn stories. As a researcher myself, how did you do it? And how did you decide? I want to say that for anyone who hasn't read this book, one of the things that really impresses me about it is that you've done a really, I think, conscientious job with diversity. There's diversity among the victims and diversity among also the aggressors, and so you capture a wide range of experiences. I think you filtered that really beautifully. And I'm just curious, like, how did you make your list? How did you cull it down? How did you do it, Bob?
Well, it's some of it was, like I said, like, I think the reason SF Weekly had me doing this stuff was because I'm now older, and so I just kind of know this stuff. My mom was a gossip. She would talk about some of the ones that were contemporary to her anyway. She would talk about some of this stuff even when she wasn't involved in it. And so it's just kind of in my head. But yeah, I also some of it's kind of sick, because I would just be like, okay, I'm going to search like this Oakland Tribune and San Mateo Times or Bay Area News for necrophilia. Let's see what turns up, cannibalism.
That's a great story, by the way.
Yeah, that I was not expecting that in Menlo Park, which is, I just was not expecting necrophilia to be in Menlo Park to be in the same thing. But yeah, necrophilia in Menlo Park, folks. The corpse mutilators of Menlo Park is in there.
Got it here.
And sometimes, like, it was actually in a weird way. Like, I used to do these things with the Google News Archive, which was just random scanned newspapers. So I was kind of feeding off a lot of AP stories, but I would just look for San Francisco stories. Mm-hmm. And the thing about the KKK membership in the SFPD is there was, like, just kind of KKK stories at the time I wrote it, and I was like, what is there any history here in San Francisco? And it turns out there was. And I would just be kind of looking for, like, key buzzwords in the digital newspaper archives I had, and just trying to find things, or just finding places like there's the Golden Gate Park stuff. There's a whole chapter on, like, 80s Golden Gate Park kind of body dumps, but that the history goes back farther. So I would just look for a place. Like, I tried so hard to find a murder or a drug ring or anything at Playland at the beach.
Oh,
and I just couldn't find it. I could find stuff at the zoo. There's stuff at there, it's animals that get killed, but those are crimes. Those are murders. The deaths of the orangutans shortly after the zoo was founded. And there's a lot of weird stuff at the zoo, but I just couldn't find, like, anything. Like, there was an accident where somebody was, like, nearly decapitated on the big roller coaster, but I just couldn't find crimes at Playland. But I would look at other places or other neighborhoods for crimes and just see what was there.
Yeah. As a kid growing up here, there was a long period when I lived just a couple of blocks from Golden Gate Park, and I would go climb through the trees and explore the park and roam around as a kid, in the 80s. And our parents weren't helicoptering in those days. But I remember also there always being a slight undercurrent of it being kind of ominous. You just knew that the bushes, the shrubs, the trees could hide things, and you capture it so beautifully in this one sentence I marked. This is about the founding of Golden Gate Park, and then he says, after 20 some odd years of meticulous landscaping, all those newly planted trees came to provide excellent cover for corpse disposal and lonely suicides. I thought, yes, Yes, I felt that as a child, without knowing it, but there was that feeling. I love your Golden Gate Park section. It's horrible, and I love it.
Oh,
So,
it's terrible. Yeah. I had a professor at Kenyatta College in Redwood City, of all things. He was an anthropology professor, and he was actually called to help his friend, who was the coroner in San Francisco, open up the barrels from the mid 80s. So that was like, I just see, that's what I mean, is I just kind of have been around long enough that I remember, oh, what was up with those bodies in the barrels. And also, hey, people I know on Facebook and Twitter would also feed me. I should probably have 3 extra pages of acknowledgments for people just asking, like, hey, what about that? And that ends up being a chapter or a section of a chapter in the book, just people asking that stuff of me.
So we should open this up. There's a whole bunch of questions.
Okay.
Let's see. There's a ton of them. And somebody wants to know, and we were just talking about this, Bob, why not the zebra killers?
I wrote 3 drafts of a potential chapter on the zebra killers. I would keep coming back to it, but that case touches on so many different things. I mean, it touches on race and religion, and to do the zebra killers. And I still hope that enough copies of this book sell that in 5-10 years, I could do the revised and expanded edition, and maybe the zebra killers will be in that. But for me to do that, to do a chapter on the zebra killers, I'd feel that it had to be my best writing, and it just wasn't by the time of deadline. And also, I had given a lot of space to Dan White and Sin Q in my brain, and so after a while, I was just fried. I know I'm making excuses here, but yeah, it never clicked. It never felt right. I never felt like I was adding something that needed to be added to that story. And it was also always spiraling out of control because, you have the death of Elijah Muhammad around that time, the founder of the Nation of Islam. His son, Herbert Muhammad, takes over for a while. It was going to be one of those things where I'd have to write 30,000 words and shrink it down to 3. And it just never quite clicked. And yeah, like I said, if I'm going to write about it, I'd have to feel as good about it as I did about my Dan White chapter or various other chapters. Like when I had to write about Dan White and Milk and Moscone and Jonestown and those big, terrible things of the 70s, I wanted it to be among my best writing. So it just never got there. I'm sorry. Next time, zebra killers, probably. I don't know.
It's a tough subject. And I am personally waiting for somebody to tackle it, but it has to be handled in exactly the right way, in a way that can, as you say, encompass all of the complexity of that story, and handle it with care. I think it would be I think you made, I don't know, it seems like a smart call. I don't think that's a 3,000 word piece. It deserves a longer treatment, and the proper longer treatment hasn't been written yet. So maybe the person who suggested that is the one for the job. I don't know.
I also didn't get the Mitchell brothers in there, so they probably would come more. Yeah, I didn't. I just
Bob.
Yeah, I know. Nobody's asked me about that. People ask me about zebra killers. Nobody asked me about the Mitchell brothers or.
So here's a softball question for Bob. Your introduction mentioned past activities. Were those at Annie's Social Club, Incredibly Strange Wrestling, and or Zeitgeist Creamed Corn Wrestling?
Well, I don't know about Zeitgeist Cream Corn Wrestling. That might have been before or after my time. I had tortillas thrown at me, but they weren't creamed in any way until they mixed with the beer. But yeah, it would be Incredibly Strange Wrestling, and then shows at Annie's Social Club and shows with Arno Core later. But yeah, definitely the ISW and Stinky's Peep Show stuff at this Covered Wagon before it was Annie's Social Club. Yeah, those are my salad days. They're in my first book, Beer, Blood, and Cornmeal: 7 Years of Incredibly Strange Wrestling, now available at your San Francisco library. They might
in the chat.
Yeah, they might have a copy of it that's fraying apart at the seams. Hope it's holding together. Hope Beer, Blood, and Cornmeal's holding together in the SFPL collection.
That could only mean it's been well loved and read many times. Someone would like to know here, Bailey. Oh, hi, Bailey. Bailey would like to know if there was any murder or crime happening in Muir Woods.
Ooh, Muir Woods. You know, there must be, and I just don't know it off the top of my head. I mean, Muir Woods has to be as much of a, oh God, I'm going to sound terrible, like cops that James Elroy talks to. Like, Muir Woods has to be as much of a body dump site as Golden Gate Park, but I don't have a Muir Woods crime. If I was still writing this stuff, I would be right now looking through newspapers.com and the Chronicle archive on sfpl.org, looking for Muir Woods and body or corpse, parentheses, you know, just to see.
Oh, here's a question. Here's a question I bet you didn't see coming. What do you think of the recent possible Zodiac killer identified?
You know, I don't really think much of it. I mean, I read through it. I don't know. I've spent a lot of time in Vallejo recently, because there's a bookstore there that's why is my name blanking on her bookstore? It'll come to me in a second. They're really doing really well for me. And I also was interviewed by the Vallejo Times Herald about this book. And, you know, Zodiac Killer starts in Vallejo.
Mm-hmm.
And you also realize that Napa and Lake Berryessa, where some of the other murders were, isn't very far, and everything. And I'm just like, any suspect that comes from looking at the San Francisco composite drawing and doesn't really place them in Vallejo, I don't think is right. It's if it isn't like Arthur Lee Allen or one of those suspects from Vallejo, it's somebody from there.
Huh.
And they are crimes of opportunity. I think we also attach too much genius or too much well, not premeditation. The murders are premeditated, but I think like people attach this kind of criminal genius to Zodiac that I think he backed into or lucked into. And they find patterns in the killings that I don't think were intentional or even really there. They were just like, he's stalking in the area that he was familiar with and where he thought he wouldn't be hurt or wouldn't be captured or wouldn't be caught. And that just happens to be in these places that, you know, where they're in different counties and different jurisdictions. I think that was accidental, but he launched a hell of a media campaign. He really did some amazing media management for himself.
Hire that man for a publicist.
Yeah, he definitely could get a letter in the paper. He definitely could. But yeah, I just don't.
We could all take a page from the Zodiac.
I would like to, you know, that the victims' families or the people that, you know, I have talked to people that knew victims, knew Zodiac victims and went to high school with them. And I would like to see them get some closure, but I don't think this is it. I do hope I'm wrong. You know, I hope these people figured it out, but I just don't think it's going to come from the composite drawing or the ciphers. I think it's in a narrow circle of Vallejo and Benicia, you know.
Here's a question from Vernon, a longtime reader of yours, who would like to know if you hazard a guess as to why Dirty Harry was set in San Francisco.
Well, it's a cop fantasy of Zodiac. It's like, you know, Dirty Harry's able to kill Scorpio. You know, it's a fantasy, you know, that the viewers of Dirty Harry, myself included, feel that the world is out of control, or you know, definitely my parents would have watched it this way. And it is the kind of Hollywood kind of, you know, Clint, you know, he was in Westerns before he was in crime movies. He was Rowdy Yates in Rawhide. Rowdy Yates finally gets the Zodiac, and in a way that never happened, that you know, so yeah, that's why it was here, is because it's a riff on Zodiac. And Clint, he is a Bay Area guy. He is from Oakland.
I didn't know that. Still don't care for him. and if he's watching, I don't care. One last question, because we are out of time. This comes from a couple of people, actually, who would like to know, in all of your research, what was the most surprising thing, or what led you in a direction that was completely unexpected?
Ooh, that's a really good question. And I don't really have an answer of it, and I will maybe post it on Twitter or on my website when I do, because this is going to be one of those. It's not an annoying question; it's a great question, but to me, it's going to be one of those things where 10 minutes after I'm not doing this talk, I'm going to think of something brilliant to say. Something that really gets to that. But these stories would always, you always had to. I can remember like the frustrating ones. Look, this is going to sound kind of weird. When I was researching Charles Sullivan, the founder of the Fillmore, I had this notion in my head because the way stuff I had read about it, it was like Bill Graham like had a deal with Charles Sullivan where if something happened to Charles, Bill Graham would get control of the Fillmore. So I did start with the idea that was Bill Graham, or should have Bill Graham been a suspect in that murder? And it turned out when I did more research that no, Charles had seen the writing on the wall for that neighborhood and was kind of looking to get out. And if these crazy white kids want to go see this psychedelic music, then who is he to stop them? When I had finished the research, that terrible idea was luckily done away with. But you have to you have to just keep reading and keep digging at sources until you find it. But that was the research question I had started with doing some of that research, was like, what if Bill Graham did it? And once I had read better accounts of the Fillmore and Charles Sullivan's business, that didn't make sense anymore. So that was completely just, any notion of that. But I did start from a terrible, terrible place. Bill Graham's an icon of American music and American music promotion, but just the way that I think some of the kind of quicker accounts made it sound like that was a possibility. Like, hey, wait a minute. They had some deal that only, was like a Perry Mason thing, but it turned out no, real life was not like that. And thank God for that. But stories that went in totally different directions. I mean, I just would sometimes, some of these stories I just would work on, like I'd try to write about them and not be able to. And then a year later I would be, so I just keep working on them and they would keep surprising me. They never really, they often weren't what I thought they were when I started reading and researching them.
Stephanie Shattuck adds, the man gave out free apples. He was not a murderer.
Yeah. No, it was a terrible hypothesis. Okay. I'm so glad that I'm not just always talking about my crackpot theory that this happened. So
but you do have some villainous musicians in your book, as well as villains of all kinds. We're running out of time, so I think that we're supposed to wrap it up now. But I want to say, for anybody who hasn't read this book, it's delightful in both the worst and best ways. So I hope that you will check it out. There are thrills and spills and horror and redemption and all of that. And I'm proud to talk with you about it, Bob.
Thank you, Alia. Thank you so much. And thanks, Anissa, for bringing us all together here and hosting this event at San Francisco Public Library.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I totally needed this event. It was so fun. I told you it was a perfect pre-Halloween event, and I see the love coming through in the chat. And one more time in the chat, links to tonight's event. You can watch it again on YouTube. Links to our presenters, their books, their handles, their socials. Find them, track them. They both are fun on Instagram and Twitter. So, friends, library community, love you. Love you, weirdos. Woo!
Love you, weirdos.
Woo! All right, friends, have a wonderful evening.